some of us, if you've been listening to the podcast, you probably know what we're going to talk about first, and that is the ever evolving saga of Pac-12 media rights. And if you're thinking, man, get back to the football, get back to, the bread and butter. Listen, this is a huge part of college athletics. Like it or not, media deals sometimes dictate program success. It's going to give access to more money or less money, probably in the case of these Pac-12 schools that are now trying to compete with these mega conferences. And this really, really matters. So if you're not interested in TV deal discussion, one, you're missing out in the case of the Pac-12 on a really comedic and really funny just
Oh
saga
yeah.
that's unfolding. It's just really easy to point at the Pac-12 and kind of laugh from a distance. But you're also just really neglecting a huge, huge part of what's making these programs, more viable in this new college football world that we're moving into. So Garrett, I'm going to break this down just quickly. Quick review if you're just joining us on this episode of Days of Our Pac-12 Lives. The week before the Super Bowl, the rumors start rumbling that SMU and San Diego State are joining the Pac-12. We're speculating on the pod that this might be kind of an attempt to broaden the markets, right? Move into the central time zone with SMU and kind of lock down Southern California with San Diego State. But the previous TV deal with ESPN is having real problems. The scheduling's bad. We love to talk about Pac-12 after dark. Not really a good business model, though, right? It's not going to be good
Right.
for the eyeballs. It's only really the diehards or the people on the West Coast that are staying up for those games. The production quality was bad. The money was not keeping up with the other conferences. And then one by one, these major players in college sports that we think are going to be taking a stab at these Pac-12 media rights that are going to be up for grabs just start dropping out. CBS and Turner say no thanks. Apple TV kind of stalled for a little bit. Amazon looked like they were going to, I know you and Mitch talked about this, but looked like they were going to offer something that wasn't really appealing to the Pac-12. So
Mhm.
then this week, we get the news that a new contender has entered the ring, and we hear the music playing over the speakers of the Ion television network. And if you're asking yourself, what's the Ion television network? If you have DirecTV, go to TV Land and then go up one or two. And that should tell you enough about just where we're at as a Pac 12, right? Like if you're in the same neighborhood as TV Land on the dial, not necessarily one we're known for sports content. So Garrett, I don't know what your initial reaction was to that news this week. Obviously, it's been coming out. Stuart Mandel has kind of clarified that Ion is not involved with the TV deal based on a source with direct knowledge of the situation. But when I saw that, my first reaction was, "What is Ion?" And then I remembered what Ion was, and it made it
Right.
even more funny.
No, yeah. Well, so when I see the news, I'm at work, and I can't react immediately because I was like you. I said, "Wait, Ion? Is there like a new sports something that started that's called Ion? Like, what is? Am I saying it right? Is it Ion? Is it Ion? Is it ION? Like, what am I trying to even say here?" And then you realize again you're in TV land. You're down the road from a game show network and stuff like that, and you start to wonder, wait, hold on a second here. I'm not sure if this is even a sports broadcaster. Like, I didn't realize that they did sports. It's kind of like how 5 or 10 years ago you flipped on TBS and you saw March Madness and you said, wait, I didn't know TBS did March Madness. Well, they
Yeah, there's the
didn't,
whole
but
there's the
all
whole
of a sudden.
campaign that True TV, True TV
Right.
is real, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so, I was curious about, okay, well, why would they do this? Well, apparently Ion, they have 61 local TV stations and they've kind of launched their own thing. They're owned by Scripps, and so they're trying to kind of, I think, branch out and broaden what they're doing. Reruns of Psych can only get you so far. And so, I think they're just trying to broaden it out. So it can't be too bad, right? They were talking with, Amazon about like a package of games as opposed to full conference rights. They're talking about, hey, we'll take, this time slot and this time slot and maybe one game of the week. And if you're a Pac-12 fan, you didn't want to hear any of that. You don't want to say, well, I hope my team's performing well enough, otherwise I won't see them on TV this year. I mean, that's what we had to go through back in like the mid 2000s when we were just, listening on the radio to see if we could find our team online on the internet or something like that. And so, don't want to revert back to that. You certainly hope your team's on TV somewhere. But those talks kind of stalled out. Apple TV is still technically a player. I think that they're still in the mix for all of this. Yeah, some conflicting information with Brett McMurphy saying that Ion is a potential partner. Stuart Mandel comes out, says, I got a source with direct knowledge. That's not happening. It's just a really confusing time, I think, for the Pac-12. And I don't want to continue to dunk on SMU or San Diego State or any of them, but when we brought up the question of is this a good idea, this is what we were talking about, right? We wanted to say, hey, we don't know what the TV deal is going to look like. Are you sure this is even an upgrade? Now, I think competition-wise, clearly it is. But again, this is still possibly not even really an upgrade. And this also leads us into the whole issue with what Forbes is reporting, which I think is really interesting. With Forbes reporting yesterday, as we record this on Sunday the 26th, Forbes reported that it's likely that talks are going to continue to get rolling with the Pac-12 and the ACC to possibly kick up a merger and try to combine that with a little bit of a better media deal. Down the line, if they merge conferences, maybe they can leverage more. Neither of those two conferences doing very well in the TV revenue space right now. And so I'm kind of curious what you think of that, possibly, kicking up between the Pac-12 and the ACC. I'm intrigued by that. I think that there's some real benefits to it, but I'm curious what you think about those two kind of getting together and merging.
It's fascinating because definitely the two, not just from a geographic standpoint, but just maybe from an ideological standpoint, and even from a style of play, even down to the style of play, just the conference brand standpoint, ACC and Pac-12 I don't think could be more different
Mm-hmm.
brands, right? Like the ACC definitely has more, with USC and UCLA leaving, the ACC definitely has more historic powers in the college football space.
Her.
Much more of a basketball powerhouse conference as well, with the Carolina schools, and just up and down the coast. The ACC always has really good basketball and baseball.
Right.
The Pac-12 merging with them, it's definitely a desperation move. It's definitely kind of what we've been talking about on this podcast. Is it seems like there's a musical chairs game happening with 4 chairs for 5 Power 5 conferences, and 2 of those chairs have already been claimed by the SEC and the Big Ten. So it's really 3 conferences fighting for 2 chairs. And it seems like this move would be the Pac-12 and ACC conceding that point, making it realize that, hey, neither of us are going to be viable on our own. We need to structure something together. And so I was under the understanding that originally this deal was, and Garrett, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I was under the understanding that this was just a media rights merger and trying to negotiate their media rights together. But it seems like Forbes is reporting that this is a full on conference merger, at least for football.
It,
And yeah, go ahead.
I mean, it could certainly be a full-on conference merger. I think that there's a chance that they try to end up. I think there's a chance that they try to end up merging the two in terms of some amount of athletic competition. I don't know if it'd be just a football deal or if they try to include basketball. I know that it could be difficult for some of those, like baseball with the midweeks, and trying to travel for some of those lower funded sports. It could be a little bit more of a challenge to get those to merge. But I would think, at least from a football standpoint, being able to put more brand names on the table and say that, hey, there's a possible matchup between Clemson and Washington, right? They don't really have a whole lot going on in terms of, what to mix with all these other schools. But if you could have Miami versus Oregon, those are two flashy names. You can put those on a TV broadcast and sell some tickets. You could sell some tickets to those games, get some views for those TV stations. And so, I'm just trying to think in terms of, the pros and the cons. I think obviously pros is, I think you're right. The Big 12 is in a better position right now to grab that third chair than either of the other two conferences between the Pac-12 and the ACC. Clearly, the SEC, Big Ten, they're off. They've got their spots. We're not going to have to worry about them. But I think with what the Big 12 has been able to do, bringing in teams ahead of time. I mean, we talked about it last year when Texas and Oklahoma leaving meant the death of the Big 12, and are they going to get poached by the Pac-12? Now they flipped the script completely just by adding 4 teams across the nation and saying we're gonna stand our ground and do what we have to do. I think that they're in a great position. The Big 12 are, to continue to be that kind of third tier conference. Which, yeah, it does leave 1 chair left for the Pac and for the ACC. So I almost think a merger almost has to be the solution unless you want your teams getting poached by these other conferences, right? That's really the big, pro for both of these teams is you can keep most of these teams within your conference, but maybe not all of the teams, which is kind of the last little bit that we have here, and this is the last little piece of news with Florida State and Clemson possibly, maybe leaving, and we're not 100% sure, but there's been some news breaking the last couple days about that. I'm curious what you think about their ability to maintain Florida State, Clemson, maybe talk about Miami or teams like that with the ACC, their ability to maintain some of these teams within their conference. Is this maybe, yes, a desperation play for the Pac 12, but maybe the ACC needs this just as much?
Yeah, and I tweeted this out this week in response to the possible merger. I said, in my opinion, the second this merger is announced, you're going to see Florida State, Clemson, Miami, and North Carolina peace out at a minimum,
Yeah,
and maybe even Oregon and Washington as well. This is fascinating to me because I think that there's definitely two tiers of teams that we're talking about here. You have your Florida States, your Clemsons, your Miami, even though they haven't been, relevant recently, your Oregons and Washingtons that I think from an interior standpoint, from inside their programs, they think they can compete for national championships, right?
sure.
And every other team that we're talking about here in the Pac 12 and the ACC, short of maybe North Carolina, maybe Louisville, maybe, I think that's being a little generous. You would look at that honestly and you'd say that your ceiling is not necessarily a national championship contender, short of just one
Right.
magical season, right? Those are
Sure.
not programs that are necessarily built to be the year in, year out dynasties that we've seen develop in the South over the last couple of decades, right? Not saying they can never win a national championship, but they're never going to be a dynasty in this college football universe, most likely. For
Right.
those teams that think they can build themselves or have built themselves, in the case of Clemson, into a dynasty, they don't want to be left behind those other major programs in the Big Ten and the SEC. They are going to be trying their hardest to make sure they are not getting left behind in a revenue standpoint. For everybody else, though, this deal makes a lot of sense because in 2024, we're moving to the new 12-team college football playoff, and there are 6 auto bids, right? And so we're talking about this musical chairs situation with power conferences and non-power conferences. That's kind of going out the window with the top 6 conference champions. As long as they don't change that format, which, they could go back on that any day now.
Sure.
But as long as they don't change that format, if I'm North Carolina or a borderline school, like trying to decide, okay, do I make a jump to a Big Ten where it's a significant jump up in competition, or an SEC where it's a significant upgrade in competition, or do I stay pat and just try to dominate and make it into the playoffs out of the ACC? That's a tough decision, in my
Hmm.
opinion. That is a really, really tough decision for those borderline programs. I think your Boston Colleges, your Washington States of the world, no shade to those programs, but I think they're going to be happy to end up, not in the Mountain West or the MAC, right? But for those kind of like on the bubble programs, your North Carolinas, your Louisvilles, your Washington, where they're currently at, maybe they could build to where they're in that next tier. But Washington right now in 2022, that's a tough decision, I think. So for Florida State and Clemson, I think if this merger happens, they're going to be trying whatever they can to get out. Those are two schools I fully expect. On the other side of the country, I think Washington and Oregon probably would as well.
Yeah, probably.
There's like 3 or 4 teams though that I think have a huge decision that they would have to make on what direction they want to go as a program.
Right. Well, and that's a hard decision to make when you think about the money getting thrown at some of these programs, right? Because, it's an easy thing to say we want to be competitive now, we want to stay competitive, but it's a harder thing when you're talking about some of these massive numbers. I think I
Absolutely.
couldn't find the graphic on Twitter, but I saw a graphic this week of what they were showing to the Florida State board to see, what the payouts would be and all of that. Right now, the ACC is getting somewhere in the like 20 million range. It might be under 20 million right now, and the SEC is getting about 51 per school.
Yeah.
And so if you're talking just straight numbers and your dollars and cents here, we're talking about $30 million you're leaving on the table by not hopping to the SEC, which is not a small number. I mean, it's a bigger number of a gap than you're making in your own conference, right? And so that's a massive amount of money that you could be making up to where you'd say, you know what, if we got to suck for 5 years, I might be okay with that for what it's going to do for our facilities and for our overall budget and for everything else in our athletic department, because we need that 30 million in TV revenue more than we need to be good at football for 5 years. And so I think, you're probably right about some of these borderline teams. I think you're almost more right about teams with windows closing, teams like a Clemson, right? Clemson may, I mean, if you think about Dabo, you think about the way that the season's gone these last couple of years, not necessarily being up to what it was at the height of that run that they had with Deshaun and with Trevor Lawrence. I'm thinking, maybe for a Clemson, they might be more willing to say, I want to stay put until this whole thing blows up, and then I'll go try to play my name off of, the SEC, or, even if you end up in the Big 12, it's not the worst thing, right? They're still a good conference with a good TV deal. Whereas I think if you're maybe a UNC or a Louisville, that might actually be, an enticing number to say, hey, 30 million more. Yeah, I'll suck at football for another couple of years. We got basketball. We'll be fine on campus. And if I got to suck at football for a couple of years to make a bunch of money back and we can compete in a little while, that might make sense. I think Florida State is the interesting one here, right? They're really interesting, and just a couple numbers that I was able to find for a little bit of context. According to Dennis Dodd, Florida State have a $120 million buyout to get out of the ACC today, right? This is according to what their regions have been able to talk about, and just kind of estimating some things here. It'd be about $120 million, but that only gets them out of the conference. It doesn't get them out of their grant of rights, which that currently goes through 2036 and could cost approximately, according to David Hale, approximately $350 million. So I don't think we're in any danger of Florida State or Clemson hopping soon. But I do think that this probably puts us in a weird position in 4 years, 5 years, right? When we're talking about merging these conferences, when we're talking about a new TV deal. This could
Yeah.
make it really interesting in the next couple of years in terms of who's looking to jump, who's looking to stay, how much money can you bring in, and how far have these other conferences gone along? What if the SEC number goes up to 60 or 70 million, right? What if the Big 10 starts competing up in that 60 to 7 million range? What if the Big 12 with their resurgence maybe grabs a couple other teams and they get up towards 40 or 50 million? Like those would be huge numbers for all those conferences. And that gives, I think, teams like Florida State, Clemson, again, North Carolina, Louisville, teams like that, that really gives them something to think about.
Gracious. Yep.